Good afternoon, everyone. Look at you all. I suspect there's a lot of people meant to be working from home this afternoon. On behalf of Aberdeen Performing Arts and all our festival partners, welcome to Granite Noir 2025. I'm Brian Burnett, and I'm going to be your host for what I think is going to be a thrilling session this afternoon. Welcome to you, and a huge welcome to all our audience who are joining us online for the streaming session. As an Aberdonian, it is particularly thrilling to welcome people from all around the world this afternoon to the Granite City. So it's great to have you with us. I'll introduce you to our authors in a second or two, and also introduce you to Leslie, who's going to be signing this afternoon for anyone who wants to take advantage of the brilliant work that she'll be doing for us. We like to think of Granite Noir as a love letter to crime fiction. And in today's session, we are showing our appreciation for the kind of crime fiction that has you up all night with an insatiable need to know what's happening next. I think we all know that feeling as you get closer and closer to the truth. Your mind's racing, your heart is pounding, and before you realize it, you've not actually been breathing for the past couple of minutes. You're going to feel like that all over again this weekend as we introduce you to two masters of the art of the page turner. Now, the eager detectives among you will have noticed there is an empty seat. That's because Sam Blake, who was meant to be joining us this afternoon, unfortunately was the victim of a cancelled flight, so she can't be with us. However, I see we've still got her book here as a fond tribute, and you will still be able to buy it along with signed copies of the other books. Before we get to those books, it's time for us to meet our local in the limelight, which is where we invite an up-and-coming Northeast author to share their work. Over the past 20 years, Aberdeen Performing Arts has made a real effort to get people participating in arts and culture. And that's why this particular bit of Granite Noir is so important to us. We're kind of stretching the definition of local this afternoon, all the way from Bonnie Dundee, with a story about a seagull that people in Aberdeen will definitely relate to. It's called Gullible, and please a warm welcome for Cara Scott Morrison.
For once, Fraz was feeling lucky. Sure, the morning had gotten off to a shaky start. Not only was he up at the arse crack of dawn for some mad employability course that the job centre was pushing on him, but the bastards even had the cheek to hold his benefits ransom until he'd completed it. And to top it off, an AWOL bus pass had forced him to sacrifice his roll money for the fare, meaning he'd had to endure the torturous ordeal on an empty stomach. The second they were finished, and he was no longer a hostage of the state, Fraz grabbed his jacket and legged it to freedom. Safely outside, he zipped his puffer and stuffed his hands in his pockets, only to find a crisp £20 note that certainly hadn't been there before. He pulled his jacket down for closer inspection. The once crooked, completely fake North Face badge was now perfectly aligned. In his hurry to escape, he'd lifted the wrong jacket, upgrading his knockoff puffer to the real deal. Talk about luck. With his stomach now growling, Fraz knew exactly where to take his newfound wealth. The short trek to the Esplanade was more than worth it for the Gull and Grill's famous TikTok toasty. Scurry insurance for an extra quid, mate. Fraz looked at the toasty guy like he was speaking another language. You it? For the seagulls, in case they pinch your lunch. Sounds like a rip-off, pal. Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you. Seagull insurance. He'd heard it all now. Settling on an empty bench, he opened the warm brown box. No wonder these bad boys went viral. That cheese pool was unreal. But Fraz wasn't the only one who thought so. Before he could even get his mouth around it, something smacked him square in the face. It fucking hurt. But not as much as the sight of pure toasted perfection landing straight into some greedy gull's bastardin beak. Fraz could only watch as the determined wee fucker carried his lunch out to sea. Embarrassed and raging, Fraz needed a win. So with a pocket full of change, he stepped into the garish glow of the amusements. But after sinking coin after coin into the fruit machine, it coughed out nothing but disappointment. Maybe his luck had run out. And that's when he spotted it. He never usually bothered with the claw machines, their glass cases fogged with years of sticky fingers. But there, sitting in prime picking position, was a stuffed seagull. At first, Fraz thought the wee bastard was taunting him, but then he noticed it. Zip-tied around its cuddly throat was a clear box housing a mobile phone and a promisingly thick roll of banknotes. Okay, so the phone looked second-hand, but all that cash? For 20p a go, it was worth a punt. Sliding a coin into the slot, he took a deep breath and manoeuvred the claw over the target. Fraz pushed the button, watching the mechanical fingers tighten around the soft skull. As the bird started to take flight, he couldn't believe it. These things were usually rigged. Dropping to his knees, he greedily scooped his prize out of the flap. Delighted that his luck was back on his side, Fraz marched straight out of the amusements and back to the bench, immediately freeing the box from his new feathered friend. He was right about the phone. A bit beat up, but sellable for sure. He pressed the button on the side and watched the screen come to life, displaying the time and a fingerprint icon. Typical. He discarded it next to the stuffed seagull and investigated the real prize. The roll was heavy. He'd never held this much money before, not even in Monopoly. As he peeled 20 after 20, a few 50s too, he realised the notes were wrapped around something. With a firm shake, the contents fell to the floor. A mottled, grey, and undeniably human finger rolled to a stop at his feet. Well, at least he knew how to unlock the phone. But what the fuck was he meant to do? Fling the finger and keep the cash? Nah. Whoever put that box in the arcade was sure to find him. The place was crawling with cameras. And the police? No chance. Fraz wasn't a grass. Without counting it, he pocketed the cash. Then, using a 50 as the world's most expensive napkin, he picked up the finger and pressed it onto the phone's screen. A few wiggles and he was in. But the victory was short-lived when Fraz realised his own face was staring back at him. Unlocking the phone must have triggered the selfie cam. Now they definitely knew what he looked like, and from the most unflatteringly shite angle as well. His mind was racing, stomach turning, heartbeat thumping in his ears. Duff, 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 duff. He didn't hear the squawk. Fraz tried to shield himself as the toasty thieving prick dive-bombed him. He flapped an arm at the bastard, but he only made it angry. It screamed as it took to the sky, circling. Fraz couldn't fight it off a second time. The phone, the 50, and the finger fell from his grasp. He could just make out the glint of a ragged fingernail hanging from the wee shite's beak as it took off. The phone buzzed at his feet. Bus station, 8 p.m. Bring the phone and the finger. Keep the cash. When Monday finally rolled around, Fraz found himself in front of a dusty old desktop, ready to start his compulsory employability course. Thankfully, no one had clocked the jacket. It'd be hard to explain the stains on the sleeve. Right, students, we'll be starting with some IT basics. Touch typing. Everyone, take your right hand and place it on the keyboard. Fraz looked down at his bandaged stump. Well, fuck. So much for feeling lucky. Thanks.
Once again, Cara Scott Morrison. Remember where you heard that name first. 10 minutes in and 11 swearies. 12 if you count wee shite as a swearing. That was brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. Let me introduce you to our two authors this afternoon. Tony Kent, first of all, combines being a best-selling author with a day job as a practicing criminal barrister. His pacey thrillers have seen him compared to David Baldacci and Lee Child. In The Shadow Network, which is the book we're going to be talking about today, he's once again created a really complicated web of lies and secrets and double agents. It is an absolutely terrific read, and as our own Ian Rankin says, Tony's books are absolute belters. And if you thought being a lawyer and a writer was a tricky balancing act. Try being James Oswald, who has somehow managed to find time to write over 20 books, whilst at the same time running a 350-acre livestock farm in northeast Fife. He has left the farm to join us today, and fans of James's previous work will be delighted to know that Inspector Tony McLean is struggling with the concept of retirement and is tempted to get back involved again when bodies start turning up in disused Edinburgh churches. It's sometimes creepy, it's always gripping, and for our sins will pull you into a world of secrets and danger. Please give a Granite Noir welcome to Tony and James. Welcome to you both. We're going to chat for a bit. Then towards the end, I'd love to open this up and get your questions as well. And also, by then, you'll have fallen in love with these guys and their books, and there'll be a chance for you to go to our Waterston signing table and purchase signed copies of both the novels, and Sam's as well. This is all about gripping thrillers. Are there techniques? What's the secret to getting us turning the page?
Short chapters.
Yeah, I think it's the answer. Short chapters and a little bit of a hook at the end of each one.
Yeah.
You know, always don't end it on a big cliffhanger. Sometimes do, but always have a question at the end of the chapter. You want to know what's coming next.
You're particularly good at that. I think it's the end of chapter 9, where the young man is being interviewed about the priest, and I just remember thinking, well, I have to keep going now. You know, there's no way I'm going to go and leave to go to work. I need to keep reading this.
Your employers must love you.
I mean, short chapters is a slightly jokey answer, but actually, the other thing you say, it is all about, for me at least, stories are all about character. So if you can get the characters and get you caring about the characters as quickly as possible, so distilling the key points about each character and introducing them as quickly and economically as possible will keep people wanting to know. If you don't care about the characters after page 10, you're not going to carry on with the book, or I certainly don't.
So as readers, if we are desperate to get to the next chapter, to find out what's going to happen, does that work for you as writers?
Yeah, I think you have to want to do that yourself. It has to make sense. It has to be natural. If you try to force the short chapters, if you try to do that in a way that isn't natural and doesn't just happen, then it won't work as a reader. It has to be written, for me, it's got to be written at the same sort of a pace. It can't be written as fast as you read it, of course, but it has to be written at the same kind of a pace as you would read it.
But you do develop a writing style. I mean, I've written fantasy as well as the crime fiction. And fantasy, you tend more, the chapters are much longer, the descriptions are much more wider and deeper and whatever. You get yourself into a mindset when you're writing, for me, crime fiction, Tony thrillers. It's an economy of language. So you find the simplest and most concise way of describing things, and leaving out as much as you possibly can, which then translates itself naturally into short scenes and short chapters, which is, I think, what propels a lot of these stories.
And are you aware of what's going to happen next as you're writing? How carefully plotted is it?
I am a very, very bad plotter. I'm too impatient, and I think that's another thing. I write, when I'm actually writing, I write quickly. So, because I'm impatient, I want to get to the next chapter and the next scene or whatever. But I genuinely don't know how the book's going to end when I start writing it.
Which really surprised me, because I heard you interviewed and you talked about that. And then when I read the book, I thought, this is quite a complex story with a lot going on. How on earth do you pull that off?
I go a little insane with each book. I mean, there's an awful lot happens after the first draft. I mean, I write my first draft really quickly. I sometimes jokingly call it vomit draft. So you vomit it all up and then you poke around in it for the good bits. But But a lot of this isn't what I first sat down and started typing into the computer. This has gone through many edits and shuffling scenes around and chucking stuff out. So that for me, I just don't have the patience to plot books. Do you plot your books?
I don't plot them at all. Literally, I sit down in front of a blank screen and just start writing.
God, now that really surprises me because unless I had to make notes, I had to like draw myself a list of here's who the characters are, this is what happened, just so I could keep pace with it. So I find it extraordinary that you don't start like that.
Well, the project I'm working on at the moment, I've had to actually plan it out for the 75-page document, which is completely alien to me because all of my other books, literally, I sit down at a blank screen. I've normally got a germ of an idea, but no more than that. Ordinarily a one-liner. So the Shadow Network, the one-liner that I began this with is war crimes trial. There's no war crimes trial in this book. It's nothing to do with it. It just happens, some of it happens in The Hague, and that's as close as we get to a war crimes trial. But that was it. Dempsey and Devlin are involved in a war crimes trial. Let's see what happens. And I just sit down at a blank page and start writing.
It feels like both of you are saying you're kind of not in charge here.
It's a weird thing. There's a quote from, and I hate saying it because it sounds really pretentious. There's a quote from Keith Richards about when they asked him where do the songs come from, and he said, "Well, I sort of pull them down. They're there, and I pull them down, and they happen." And I always used to think, what a load of arty-farty crap. But actually, once I started writing properly and realised this was how I do it, I completely get it. It is like you're plucking something that's already there.
And for you, James?
Well, I've usually got some themes that I want to explore or some things that have been bothering me and preying on my mind. And this one, for instance, one of the characters, there's a young boy who was abused as a child. And it had come out, I went at a very, very young age to a boarding school in the south of England, which is why I don't sound like a fifer. And didn't happen to me. There was plenty of physical abuse there, but some of the boys were sexually abused by one of the teachers while I was there, and he continued doing it because he was very good at covering his tracks for many years after. And not that long ago, one of the boys from a few years after I'd been there as a grown man, came forward and it all came out, and he was accused, and I think he's currently in jail unless he served his sentence and is out again. But that got me thinking, and the Nicky Campbell thing that was in the news as well, around about the same time as I was writing this. And that all kind of distilled into it, and I was thinking, it takes that long for the consequences to come. These people get away with this stuff for so long. And that was kind of my theme for the book. And then I just kind of thought, well, how am I going to write this? Just start writing a story and see what happens. So that's how much, I don't have a plot as such, but I definitely have a theme that I want to explore, or an injustice that I want to see righted, whatever.
Tony, are you, when you're working on these big cases, are you finding little nuggets and storing them away as future plots?
Do you know what? I'm really not. The books I write are, I have two main characters. One is my James Bond, Jack Reacher type called Joe Dempsey. He's my primary main character, series character. His best mate is a barrister who comes from a slightly dodgy past. But the fact that Michael is a barrister, Michael Devlin is his name, the fact that he's a barrister is almost purely incidental. You almost never see him at work. The second book is actually him defending a trial, Marked for Death. But other than that, you almost never see him at work. He just happens to get into these scraps because of the position that he's in, the people he knows. And so almost none of what I write is around the law, even though one of the main characters is a barrister. And the reason for that is because I still do that job full time. So I appreciate how entertaining that job would seem to everybody else. I write still for a hobby. It's a hobby with deadlines and contractual pressures and all those sort of things, but it is still my hobby. And because I write as a hobby, it needs to be something I'll enjoy. And if I were to come home at night and write about the stuff that I've been doing during the day, it would just make my day job never-ending. And it's a pretty never-ending day job anyway. And the other reason is because I specialise in organised crime. My specialty is defending allegations of organised crime. All of my clients know that I write. And although I do my day job under a slightly different name, they know that Tony Kent is Tony Wyatt and that Tony Wyatt is Tony Kent. And if any of them were to find something in my books that made them say, hang on a minute, that looks a bit familiar, my kneecaps might not go the right way for much longer. So,
Well, presumably the Bar Association would have something to say about it if you started...
I'm less worried about them.
Well, they won't do your kneecaps, I guess.
Because someone like mild-mannered James has to imagine the darkness and has to imagine these dirty deeds, but you're seeing them and hearing about them every day. Does that give you an advantage, though, over other writers?
I don't think that does. I grew up in a really rough environment. I didn't come up with where most barristers come from. I grew up in a fairly rough environment, around fairly rough people. I knew a lot of people that were robbing banks and doing this and doing that. As I was growing up, I knew very well. I became a barrister because my oldest brother had a trial for a jewellery robbery that I watched and I was very taken with and thought, that's a good job, I'd like to do that. So my entire background is very much immersed in that world. So I'm not sure whether it's the job that gives me that advantage or just the general background anyway. The one advantage I do have, I think, is in violent scenes because of the boxing that I boxed for a very long time. I was for a lot of fights for a long time. And I think that made me understand the reality of violence better than most. Yeah. And I hope that comes across in what I write, as I try to make sure the fight scenes are realistic. One thing takes me out of a book is when you read something and you're thinking, all right, this guy's never, ever been in a fight in his life. You know, somebody's throwing a flying knee strike to somebody else's head and you're thinking, this is a pub. that guy there's just no possible way. So I think I have a slight advantage in knowing how fights work from a practical point of view. But that's more to do with my sporting background than anything else.
It's fascinating to hear your backgrounds. I'm already pitching a cop thriller about these two different characters. One who grew up amongst bank robbers, the other who went to boarding school. And how do they get on? You know, you're at boarding school. What part did stories and books play helping you through that experience?
Well, I mean, I'd always been, I was a very precocious reader even before I went to boarding school. I was very fortunate to grow up in a house that was full of books and with parents who didn't care what we were reading as long as we were reading. So I just read the whole time, but certainly at school, because it was a thoroughly miserable place. I mean, this was a horrible home counties boarding school for ages 7 to 13, but I was not quite 7 when I was sent there. And in the mid-70s, so you can imagine what it was like. It was grim. In fact, it came up on social media the other day. Someone posted, what's something that you got in trouble for at school? What was the most stupid thing you got in trouble for at school? I had one of my school exercise books. On the front cover it said, you had like name, house, letter, school name, and I'd written in Colditz Castle. I mean, this was 1970s. We were obsessed with the war. The headmaster at that school had fought in the war and bore a huge grudge against it. And he saw that, and I was basically given the most horrendous punishment for that, just for writing Colditz Castle.
How old were you?
I think I was about 9 when that happened. I was beaten. I was made to run around the school playing fields, given a cold shower, and then told to do it all over again. And I think for an entire afternoon, just for writing Colditz Castle. And he was a weird guy. That headmaster. He should never have been in charge of children. But you could say that about the whole school. So I mean, you say I'm very mild-mannered, but I've mined my 5 years that I spent at that school, and I've mined that for all sorts of grim, horrible things over the years.
Let's talk about the book. We'll talk about them each in detail, and then, as I say, we'll get the chance to chat some more. It's really great to have you back at Granite Noir because it all began in Aberdeen. for you, didn't it?
Well, I was at university here, and then after graduating, couldn't think of anything better to do, so I started writing, hoping that someone might pay me to do it, but they didn't. I fell in with a bunch of ne'er-do-wells who were into fantasy and science fiction and comics and stuff. And we produced for quite a year or so, a fanzine, a monthly fanzine that we printed on photocopiers and sold in pubs and things called From the Sublime. And I had a few stories in that. And through that, I met a chap called Stuart McBride, who I think one or two you may have heard of. Me and Stuart got on really well. We collaborated on some comic scripts and things. And then I moved down to Edinburgh and he stayed up here. And he, when he got his first break with Cold Granite, the first Logan McRae novel, he phoned me up and said, great news, I've got a publisher, HarperCollins, are going to publish the book. And you should stop writing all this dragon nonsense that you're writing, James. Crime fiction's the thing to do. So I took a character that I'd created for a comic script, which was kind of a spooky ghost story comic script, this chap called Tony McLean, and gave him his own series. And that was the start of me writing crime fiction.
Fantastic sellers. You got to a point with the last book where he'd retired, but now he's come back. Was it? You find it impossible to pay him off?
Well, because the previous book, All That Lives, which was book 12 in the series, and by the time I'd written that came out, I think that was my 20th novel in 9 years. And I was just exhausted. And I said, my publisher wanted more. And I said to them, well, I can write more, but I need a break. So I made it so that the end of All That Lives, Tony McLean basically, and I can say this now because it's been out a while, he hands in his resignation. And he mostly does it to protect his team because he know it's all gone to shit, and someone's head's got to roll. So he decides it might as well be his because he doesn't need the job. He's got enough money, so that's kind of why he retires. But yeah, it doesn't sit well with him. He's not a person to take up gardening or fly fishing or something. When we open with this, he's still retired. But he's very much keeping his hand in. He's interested in what's going on and forming strange alliances with old enemies, just to keep himself interested, really.
I'm going to ask you to set it up and read a little bit for us now.
Right. Well, I was having this book is, I was going to say it's been out a while now, but some people might not have read it. So by the time I've written the book, edited it, re-edited it, gone through it 100 times. I've no idea what a spoiler is. So I always just read the opening scene, because that way it's not a problem. I'm getting so old, I need my reading glasses. So this is the opening scene, and as I said earlier, that the theme of this book is sort of the consequences of bad behaviour and past sins. So this is what kicks it all off. January the 8th, 1983, Saturday. And it was a Saturday, I checked. He can still feel the heat of the priest's breath on his face, smell the stink of whiskey, hear the harshly whispered words echo in his head. Stay there and don't make a sound. You know what will happen if you do. It's dark here in the closet, warm as he is surrounded by the cassocks so recently removed by the other altar boys. He still wears his, knows it will be worse for him if he takes it off before he's told to. It will be worse for him, whatever he does. The interruption feels like a small blessing, but soon enough the distraction will be done. The special ministrations begin. God's love, visited through him. That's what Father O'Connell says. And isn't he God's voice? What he says, what he does, can't be wrong. A priest cannot sin, can he? Footsteps on the stone floor, and he shrinks back into the closet, wraps the cassocks around himself, breath stopped, eyes squeezed tight. He does not want him to come back, even as he knows it is a sin to refuse God's grace. A noise of the closet door being yanked open. He can only hold still as a growing warmth spreads from his crotch and down his leg. Fear smells like piss. An eternity passes as he waits for the hand to reach in and grab him, and then the door closes. He trembles with relief as he hears new noises, the clink and thud of silver against silver, another crash, the familiar sound of the vestry door as it slams shut. And then a silence falls, so total he wonders if he has gone deaf. Only his heart and the soft bubbling of snot from his nose reassures him is not. How long does he wait there, unable to move? An hour? 5 minutes? He cannot say. And then another sound, low like the sad keening of an injured beast. It rises and falls until he can't know whether it is real or his imagination. He reaches for the door, black in front of him. Father O'Connell had latched it closed, but now it swings open to his touch. Slowly, wincing at the dampness in his trousers, he steps out of the closet. Across the small vestry, the door to the outside hangs ajar. The censer, chalice, and candlesticks are gone from where they had been left for him to polish for Sunday Mass. Chairs lie on the floor, hymnals scattered and ripped. The priest is nowhere to be seen. He should flee, he knows, run all the way home. But he knows, too, the hell that awaits those who disobey God's will. And who knows God's will better than a priest? Slowly, reluctantly, he walks a squelching path to the other door and the nave beyond. Father? His voice trembles and squeaks. He knows it will annoy the priest, but there is no answer from the gloom. No light from the dirty stained-glass windows. Only fat candles on the altar to cast any illumination. Father? He takes the 2 stone steps down, passes the pews and into the aisle. A nod of the head, the instinctive sign of the cross as he turns to face the altar. And that's when he sees. Father O'Connell lies on his front, arms wide as if he's genuflecting. But he is still. So still. No sound of murmured prayer. A step towards the altar uncertain. Then another, and a third. He cannot see the priest's face. His lank black hair splayed out around his head like a fan. Longer than it should be. It spreads past his shoulders, down the steps to the chancel. Not hair. Blood. He crouches by the still form, unsure what to do. There is so much blood. Is the priest dead? Before the thought has faded, a hand reaches out and grabs his wrist. That same hand that has touched him too many times before, administered God's special grace. He tries to pull away, but the grip is too strong, the weight of it heavy as the priest pulls himself slowly around. Bloodshot eyes, crazy and wide with something that looks like fear. Flecks of bloody spittle cover his lips, spot the rough stubble on his chin as the priest croaks in a voice laced with panic and despair and utter terror. Help me.
Thank you. Thank you. I want you to read my bedtime story tonight. I mean, that was beautifully done.
Brilliantly read, wasn't it?
Well, then I'll give you
You sound so much more Scottish when you're reading.
Aye, that was great. With all its kind of mortal sins, sacred rites, and all the rituals, why is the Catholic Church so interesting to write about?
I think, I don't know, it's just kind of, it's, as you say, it's the sacred rites, it's the mysteries, it's the secrets, it's the ritual and everything. It taps into that idea of otherness, and the tacit admission of a afterlife of angels and demons and supernatural beings that may or may not come and interfere in your life. That's my playground, as it were, when I'm writing fiction. So it really fits really well.
Because you're going to write about the Catholic Church in your next book as well. What's the fascination for you?
It's not the next one. It's coming. It's not the next one. I was brought up very Roman Catholic. I was in the Vatican this summer for my friend to be made an archbishop. So we're quite sort of fully in the church. But I find it fascinating. I find it completely fascinating. I find the theology side of it fascinating. I find the institutional side of it fascinating. Every bit of it. There's so much to it that there's just so many different avenues you could go down. You could write a book like the Da Vinci Code. Well, I wish I could write a book like the Da Vinci Code. But you could write a book like the Da Vinci Code, which goes down one particular route. Or you could write a book like the one I'm writing, which is all about the Vatican Bank and how it could be used for money laundering, and how having control of the Vatican puts you in control of the best money laundering apparatus in the world. And those are two so completely different things. One's entirely theological, one's about the reality of the church, the other's about the practicality of the church and how it could be used. And there are so many other avenues. Those are just two. There are very few institutions on the planet that give you so much scope for fiction as the Catholic Church.
For Sins is very much a picture of Edinburgh as well. You know, you write about the dry sandstone tenements, the windows grimed with salt spray from the Firth of Forth, the brutal concrete monolith that's the John Lewis department store. How difficult is that? At least they still got a John Lewis. How difficult is it when you're sitting looking at your room at the coos and the sheep and the farm?
Well, it's a funny thing. I did live in Edinburgh for a while. I did a postgraduate degree, curiously, in artificial intelligence. And I lived in Roslyn for 5 years, whilst my partner was doing a PhD at the Dick Vet. So I do know the city reasonably well. But I did find, when I wrote the first two books in the series, Natural Causes and the Book of Souls, I was living in mid-Wales. And just everything was coming from my memory. This was before we even had Google Maps, so I did have to do it all from memory. And I bought myself a couple of Ordnance Survey Land Ranger maps of the city and the surrounding area and pinned them on my study wall. And I'd use that as a reference, and I'd worked just off in a call centre just off Leith Walk, so I could remember the areas like there. I'd worked briefly in a bank in the Grassmarket, so I could set stuff there. I knew Newington quite well because I'd lived there as an undergraduate, and a lot of the early scenes in my early books happened in and around Roslyn, Straighton, Midlothian, that area, because it was stuff I could remember.
Yeah.
And of course, I sometimes get stuff spectacularly wrong. So I was looking at the map of the area where I'd worked in a call centre, which is just off Leith Walk, and then you only have to go like a thumb width north, and you're in Trinity. So I remember walking around that area in my lunch break and thinking it was a bit run down and daggy, because that isn't Trinity, that's the bit below Trinity. Yeah. But I described Trinity in Natural Causes, I think, as being full of drug addicts and prostitutes.
Wishful thinking.
Well, I had a very irate email from someone saying, "I think you'll find that's where all the judges and lawyers live." So I emailed him back, said, "I rest my case." But yeah, so I do get stuff wrong, but when I'm describing a place, I mean, apart from, there is actually a scene, if I can find it in here, where Tony McLean's thoughts about the new hotel in the St James Quarter are described. But I tend to try and describe the feeling of a place rather than the actual physical thing. So that salt spray on the windows and things like that, I'm not trying to describe exactly what the building's like. I'm just giving you little snapshots. And that's kind of how I look at the world anyway. And it's all in my head.
Let's find out how you look at the world and talk about Shadow Network. It begins with Con, who's a lawyer. He's been caught up in what we believe is a terror attack. He's faced with a choice. To run into the open was to risk death, but to stay might just guarantee it. What happens next?
Oh, what happens next? Well, Con is one of those characters that I like to start a book with, in the sense that he's not a main character. I always like to start my book away from my main character so that you can just start with a bang. If you start with a bang, that normally means someone dies, and if you've got your main characters there, then that means they die, so you can't have them.
It's a bit of a stumbling block.
Exactly. So we meet Con at the beginning. Con is effectively our gateway into this plot. The plot of the Shadow Network is all about Russian espionage, a 100-year-old Russian shadow network that has been manipulating world events throughout all that time. And they are based primarily based in Russia and America. They have agents embedded here, there, and everywhere. And what we find with the Shadow Network is Dempsey, my main character, and Devlin are dragged into the outcome or the aftermath of this terrorist shooting. And what they discover is it's not a terrorist shooting. It's designed to look like one, but in reality, it's a targeted shooting to take out 2 lawyers and their covert informant, I suppose you'd call them, the person who's about to tell them the things they need to know. And once discovering this, they then find themselves targeted by the network. Now, for various reasons I won't go into, because you read the book, the network is temporarily slightly weakened because of interest elsewhere. So they are able to get to the bottom of something that otherwise would be much too big for them. And it's all about their investigation into what this is and to discover whether or not this mysterious, mythical, century-old figure called the monk can possibly really exist.
Devlin and Dempsey see each other as family.
Yeah.
What's the relationship? What do they give to each other?
I think they're both unique in their own way. Dempsey comes from the first book they meet each other is when they first become friends. And we see everything that Michael loses at that time. Michael was somebody who has lost his family and then loses the rest of his family throughout the first book. And what Dempsey is the man who comes in and puts a stop to that and protects him in a way that only a brother would. So in that way, you have that connection. Whereas for Dempsey, he's living in a world where you just can't trust anyone. He's living in a world where you just don't know who is the next double agent. You just don't know who is the next betrayal. And we see throughout the books just how often he is betrayed by people that he would ordinarily care for, or people he does care for.
That's what makes it a great read as well.
Yes.
I'm going to get you to read. No pressure after James.
I can't match that. I'll read a paragraph.
Yeah, and feel free, in the style of a barrister, to pace up and down and convince the jury of this. So let's have something from the Shadow.
I'll read literally the first page, and then I'll stop somewhere totally random because nothing particularly exciting happens. But since I need to read, I'll read.
It's a banging opening though.
Thank you very much, but unfortunately it's across a couple of chapters and we don't have time. Con Frankowski did not register the single bead of hot sweat as it trickled down his cheek. He did not notice as it disappeared into the thickness of his fashionably unkempt beard, nor was he aware of the 3 further snaking lines of perspiration that followed it. It was only the 5th droplet falling from his brow onto the space key of his open laptop that made him aware of the effect of the midday sun. He wiped away the wetness as he glanced up from his screen, his concentration replaced by anxiety. Looking beyond his small, otherwise empty table, he tried to gauge if he was being watched by any of the hundreds of people who surrounded him. To his relief, none showed the slightest interest in a heat-swept tech geek and his homework. Not a care in the goddamn world, Con thought to himself, resentment stirring in his gut. Nothing but sun and liquor. The Grotmark had once been a centre for trade, the commercial hub at the heart of The Hague, which was itself the 3rd largest city in the Netherlands. But like so many historic European centres, that past was long gone, those origins almost forgotten. Today, the square was the city's prime social destination, encircled by trendy bars and overpriced eateries, all designed to siphon off its patrons' spare cash under the guise of providing fun-filled downtime. From sunrise until way past sunset, the Grotmark was guaranteed to be teeming with overexcited, overstimulated bodies, all high on caffeine or alcohol, or later in the day, something a lot stronger and a lot less legal. Throw in the unusually tall average height across the Dutch population, and a man of normal size, a man like Con, could easily get lost in a crowd like this, which was precisely why he'd chosen this location for the meet. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. You tell great stories. How much of being a barrister is being a storyteller?
It depends on the kind of barrister you are. There are very different kinds of barristers. My kind of barrister is 100% a storyteller.
Right.
Everything I do in court is designed to be able to make the barnstorming speech. I became a barrister for a number of reasons. One of them, I told you earlier, I saw my brother in court and I was very taken by it. That's all very true. It's also because I watched too much TV and too many films, and I watched A Few Good Men many, many times, and I watched A Time to Kill many, many times, and I took them to heart rather more than most barristers do, and that's been the basis of my practice ever since. I try to cross-examine like Tom Cruise in A Time to Kill, yet to succeed. I try to make a closing speech like Matthew McConaughey in A Time to Kill, and that I have done a few times. The one thing I'm very good at in my job, I would say, is a closing speech. And exactly for that reason, because it's being a storyteller. It's being able to structure your speech, to be able to stand in front of a jury for an hour and speak to them about the 3 months of evidence they've just heard, and do that in a way that doesn't lose them. It requires structure, it requires pace, it requires knowing when to move on to the next bit. It's all the skills of a storyteller. So I didn't realise it, but from the very moment I began my job, I was learning to be a writer.
And remarkably, you don't script that.
No,
that closing speech.
No, I never script anything because I've watched too many barristers read. What you'll find, so much of entertainment is set in courtrooms. I mean, a good percentage of entertainment, it must be like 5% at least, it's probably more, is set in courtrooms. Everyone likes watching it. No one wants to be on a jury. And the reason is because barristers are really bloody boring. You go to court and they take this really... I remember once I was defending a case where a chap had pushed somebody onto the railway lines in the tube station, in one of the tube stations in London. And they'd survived, so he was up for attempted murder, and we're in the Old Bailey, and I'm defending him. And the prosecutor made his opening speech, and he nearly sent me to sleep. And I was thinking, this is really interesting. Every one of these jurors has got here by tube today, as we all have. And you haven't brought this alive. How can you not have brought this alive? And that's the problem. Far too many barristers don't add any drama. They don't bring it alive. I do the total opposite. I add the drama and I bring it alive. and it makes a difference. You can turn it into an enjoyable, all right, it's very serious, it's very solemn, it's very slow, but it can still be an enjoyable experience. It can still be relatively entertaining. And you'll find that if you're the one that's entertained them, if they're a bit 50-50, they'll go your way.
I would imagine, if you're putting out feed for the cattle, it's fine to be thinking about who am I going to murder in chapter 12 and all that. But for you, is it difficult to separate your two lives?
They've got to be completely separate. I will sometimes write on the train to court, but generally, even if I'm waiting for a verdict, so let's say that I have a jury go out, I'll have... in a big case, they could be out for 2 weeks. And in that 2 weeks that they're out deliberating the case, I won't write a word while I'm at court. I just can't turn my brain off court mode once I'm in that building. Once I get home, I set aside my writing time and I do my writing time, but they have to be totally separate. They are entirely compartmentalised. And primarily because one has to still seem like a hobby. I know it's not a hobby. I know I'm lying to myself. I know I'm lying to all of you. I am absolutely telling you lies. It's not a hobby. But it has to seem like a hobby. Yeah. Because the moment it feels like a job, then I'm working too hard.
And what about farmer, author? How do you balance that out?
Well, I don't watch any telly. I have actually cut back the farming quite a lot in the last few years. I used to have sheep. I don't have sheep anymore, and I rent out that grazing to my neighbour. So I've just got the Highland cows, which don't require quite as much work. But I do the farming during the day. I'll have my tea and then I'll sit down and write sort of between 8 o'clock and midnight when everybody else is relaxing and watching telly or whatever. And then I go to bed.
It can't be much fun being married to you then.
No, I'm not actually married, but my partner and I have been together for a long time, and she's still with me. So She enjoys the peace and quiet.
It must take a hell of a lot of discipline.
There are times when it's really hard, and I'm sitting down and everyone's going on about the latest thing on the telly. When I look at social media and everyone's saying, oh, you should watch this. And I haven't even watched The Wire yet. Come on, I'm that far behind.
Oh, man. You've got so much catching up to do. Listen, I need to catch up now as well. I realise time is marching on. I would love to get some of your questions for James and Tony, so we'll stick up the lights a bit and we will get the roving mic to you. The hardest bit is to be the first person to ask a question. So, we got one right down in the front here. Perfect.
I'm intrigued that your background is both lawyers, barristers and writers. There's a family in Linlithgow, outside Edinburgh, called the McLeans rather, and all their books are about lawyers who defend criminals. Do you know, have you come across them before?
No.
I've not either.
No.
My McLean is named after my partner. That's her surname,
It's just
and I stole it.
because obviously your background is quite common. Barrister, writer.
So, well, once you've caught up on The Wire, you can catch up on those.
I catch up on those.
Thank you for that. Let's get another question. Gentleman right in the middle there. We'll pass. You're now being swamped by radio mics.
Just a question for Mr. Oswald there. Do you drive an Alpha?
Not all the time now. I used to. I do have a classic Alfa Romeo. What gave it away?
There's too much love in there, that's what it was.
I've seen pictures of that.
My first ever car was a knackered old rusty Alfa Romeo, and I've loved them ever since.
Okay. Car-related questions, crime-related questions. We're open for it all. Right up at the back. Let's get sprinting up there with a microphone and let's get your question.
It's a question from Mr. Kent. You said that the thing that causes the pacing is short chapters. Where's the balance? I gave up reading James Patterson because I thought his postage stamp-sized chapters offended my intelligence, and I haven't read any of his books or the people who pretend to be him for about 15 years. Where's the balance between short and intelligent?
Well, without wanting to criticise Mr. Patterson, who has sold a few more books than me, I don't disagree with you about the length of these chapters. I think they're too short. A page and a half regularly. In the book I'm writing at the moment, there is a one-page chapter. I imagine once it's off my screen, it will probably be about a page and a half. But when I say short chapters, I mean generally about 5 or 6 pages. I think you get a lot of information into that. A lot can happen in that amount of time without it dragging on. I mean, effectively, a chapter will be as long as it needs to be. So there will be a one-page chapter. I've got a cross-examination in my second book, which is a full 30-page chapter, because it's a technical cross-examination about cell sites, and it required that length of a chapter to actually get the whole thing beginning to end in there. So it's not a hard and a fast rule that they must be short, but to get your pace, it's not so much they must be short, it's they will be short. If you're writing with pace, they will be short. But I do agree with you, there is such a thing as too short, if that is chapter after chapter after chapter.
It's the great fear of an author. God, I'm going on a bit here.
Yes.
Yeah, and the writing, the program I use for writing, I write scene by scene, and there's a little word counter at the bottom. And if any one scene is getting more than 1,000 words long, there's a little bell goes off in the side of the back of my head, and I have to then think, does it justify being longer than this? And I usually try to keep, so I'll have a chapter for me will be 2 scenes of 1,000 words each, approximately. And then I know it's time to start moving on to the next bit. And that's a system that has worked for me and I've kind of internalized. But I also realize it's not hard and fast rules. So I will occasionally have scenes which are a couple of 1,000 words long, or a chapter that's maybe 4,000 or 5,000 words long, if it needs to be. But when it comes to the editing of that, I'll be looking very, very hard at that to see whether I'm waffling or whether I've started it too early, which is another thing. Quite often, if I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to be doing with a scene, I'll write too early. So I'll start writing it and then realize that actually I can lose the first 200-300 words and start later. Start late and leave early is always good advice.
I want to get one more quick question, and then in the last minute we've got, I want you to tell us about your next project, which thrillingly may well be finished in Aberdeen this weekend. So a quick question down the front here. And then we will wind up, and both our authors will head to the signing table to
Hi, I was
sign
just
those
wondering
books.
if you'd ever read The Perfect Crime Novel, and if so, what was it?
Both of us?
Yeah,
I've read The Perfect Thriller.
which is?
Funnily enough, what we'll talk about in a moment. The Day of the Jackal.
Right.
I think it's absolute perfect thriller.
And James?
I haven't read an awful lot of crime fiction, to be honest. And I'm rubbish at remembering. Weirdly, very, very bad at remembering books after I've read them. And I don't think the perfect anything exists. I think everything can be improved. So I can't answer that one, sorry.
To finish, you've spent the journey to Aberdeen, sitting on the train, trying to finish this next novel. You're heading back to the hotel to work on it.
Yeah.
Tell us what it's going to be.
I have been lucky enough to be asked to co-write the sequel to the Odessa File with Frederick Forsyth, which will be released in August of this year.
So no pressure there.
A little bit of pressure, just ever so slight pressure. It's the start, hopefully, of a co-writing relationship. So we've worked upon the structure for this book, the story for this book, the plot, what it will be. I referred earlier to a 70-odd page document that I've had to prepare. That was for them to sign off. That was basically my and his, this is the book, now we'll actually write the book. It's my job to write the book. And we're working on that on a number of others. So, for example, if this is successful, there'll be a sequel to this. We are also working on a prequel to The Day of the Jackal called The Jackal's War, and a few other things like that, provided all the pressure in the world that this one works. But I will hopefully be finishing it tomorrow morning, I would say.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So if you finish it
In
Aberdeen,
Aberdeen.
we definitely want a mention in the acknowledgements of that as well.
Individually, everyone. If everyone leaves their name.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us, and for all of you for coming along. There's lots more at Granite Noir. If you're about tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock, we've got a session of bold new voices, 3 brilliant young authors to introduce you to. And we were talking earlier, there's a fantastic exhibition at the Music Hall about Aberdeen's criminal past, along with some incredible artifacts and pictures and stuff, which is worth checking out. I'm going to send you two to the signing table, and you can get copies of these books, and poor old Sam, who wasn't able to join us. In the meantime, thank you for coming along. Thank you to everyone who's been tuning in at home all over the place. Please join me in thanking Tony and James for a fab session.
Thank you.
Have a seat over there. Good evening. How lovely to see so many of you. I've got a couple of amazing authors for you tonight. Welcome along to Granite Noir. I think this is our 9th year. Some of you will have been here before, others perhaps not. Lovely if you've never been before. So welcome to this event on behalf of Aberdeen Performing Arts. My name is Fiona Stalker. I'm a TV and radio journalist at BBC Scotland, and I have had the joy of being involved in a lot of Granite Noirs. And I'm a huge crime writing fan, so I'm just delighted to be here. Shortly, I'm going to introduce you to our authors, and we're just going to have a chat. We've had a fascinating chat leading up to this, some of which we can talk about, some of which will stay off the record. Well, we'll see. And at the end, I think, is one of the nicest bits, is you guys get to ask questions, and anything you want. We've got a roving mic. We've got some brilliant questions last night, if anyone you were here last night. But before that, we have another treat. Just check we've mentioned everything. Yes, we have. Right. But before we do that, I want to introduce a local storyteller to you. Lexi Cunningham is a local writer who has been selected to read a short story. Lexi, it's all yours.
At least the man still had all his fingers, thought Margaret, as she counted them. It was a shame they were mostly in his stomach, with one or two in other parts of his digestive tract, but at least it would save the police investigators time looking for them. Of course, on the downside, stomach acids played merry hell with clear fingerprints, but you couldn't have everything. With that and everything else, it was going to be hard to identify him. She glanced up at the observers, making sure they had seen the fingers, and then looked again at the man's face, or what was left of it. His teeth had been smashed too. Not much chance of his mother recognizing him, let alone anyone else. And the ears. Not everyone knew that ears were unique, an even more definite identifier than fingerprints. But then, who keeps a national register of ears? Still, this man had had his ears removed. If anyone asked her, she'd say it looked like the job of somebody who knew their way around a scalpel. But then, for all she knew, there was probably a video on YouTube somewhere showing you how to remove an ear. There were some weird things on the internet. Her husband seemed to have watched most of them. She stepped back for a moment, turned the recorder off, stretching her arms over her head, flexing her hands. How much longer was this going to take? She just wanted to go home and have her dinner and a glass of wine, have a bit of peace after a busy day, go to bed early with a hot water bottle and a good book. Not listen to her husband talking about the latest kitten video. But the body needed to be dealt with first. She glanced over at her assistant and turned the recorder and microphone back on. I know I said this man's about 50, but really, he's well preserved, isn't he? I mean, I don't mean he's been preserved, she added. He's just quite toned for his age. Oh, not a man who's been living rough or letting himself go, came the voice of the detective inspector, watching from the viewing room. No, I'd say not. Good muscle tone, no flabbiness. Of course, without the face, it's hard to tell. But even the teeth here, even though they aren't in place, you can see they're in good condition. Not a smoker or a heavy drinker, I'd say. Healthy. Interesting. Someone must miss him, surely. Oh, you'd have thought so. She pressed on the corpse's arm, testing the muscle structure, noting the grey hairs on the forearm. Is he not in your missing persons list? Oh, not from what we've seen so far. We'll run through the description again when you've given us all you can. Where did you find him again? Up at Tarbagger. Well off the paths. It was the inevitable dog walker that came across him. No trace of clothing or anything like that. Tricky, undressing a dead man. I see he's probably had a wedding ring, she said, but that's gone. though it might have come off with the finger, of course. Oh, aye, that's what we thought, no sign of it. Are there cameras up there, round the car park? Not that it's any of my business, she added quickly. I'm not trying to teach you your job. The inspector laughed. Aye, and I'll tell you the best way to analyse the stomach contents. No, there's no cameras up there, and it's not one of those places people hang around after dark at the car park at night. We're thinking it was night time he was taken up there, maybe killed on the spot. It's hard to tell, with pretty rough ground, but there's no sign he was moved after death. No, she agreed. Judging by the lividity, he's been on his back since his death. No sign of a struggle either, though I think no bruising on the arms, and the fingernails aren't broken. She sensed, more than saw, the inspector shuffle a bit up in the viewing room. He cleared his throat. Go on, then. Estimated time of death? Aye, right, she said with a grin. About 3:15 last Thursday afternoon. Ha, thought you'd say that. No, but seriously, she said, I'd say he hadn't been there very long. Tuesday night would make sense, later rather than earlier, maybe around 3 or 4 in the morning. She'd been sound asleep in her bed by then, she remembered. She wished she was there now. Much appreciated, Margaret, said the inspector. I know it's not the most popular question, eh? No. She was back at work again, poking through the remaining stomach contents. The fingers and thumbs were lying in a row on a stainless steel tray. No sign of the wedding ring. Not much else in here. Do they all match? Weird question, I ken, but are they all his and all? I'll take a closer look when I'm done, she said. Nothing now to say they're not. They look about right. Oh, I need to dot the I's and cross the T's, he said apologetically. No, there's nothing else barring the usual residue. I'll have it checked. Nothing I can identify with the naked eye. I thought maybe if he didn't struggle, he might have been drugged. She smiled a little behind the mask. Yes, it's a fair point. Of course, we'll check for any traces. And we'll record DNA samples, if you ever find someone to try to match them to. Aye, thanks. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Oh, I'd say you'd find him, probably. A well-maintained fellow like this. He'll have someone coming looking for him, sooner or later. Someone looking for him, sooner or later. The words bounced around in her head sometime that evening, as she settled in at last with her steak and chips and her glass of wine and her book. Ah, there would be, no doubt. She listened for a moment. Silence. None of the gasps and groans she was used to. None of the irritating commentary from the other armchair as her husband insisted she watch some other stupid little video on whatever the latest social media site was he had found, interrupting her reading. His fingers used to tap, tap, tap at the screen, flicking nonsense up and down so she too could appreciate the playful kittens, the horrific car crash, the outrageous political statement. He'll not be using those fingers again anyway, she thought, remembering them lying in a row on the stainless steel tray. Her cases were packed. By the time anyone came looking for him, she would be long gone. Thank you.
Lexi, that was fantastic. I think that touched a few raw nerves here as well, I think, judging by the comments. Please look after your fingers later. Quite a few of you. Let me introduce our authors now, and also the wonderful Leslie, who is signing off to our left, who has been our companion on many Granite Noirs, and I have promised to slightly slow down my speaking for Leslie.
Noted.
First of all, Harriet Tice, who hails from Edinburgh and worked as a criminal barrister for nearly a decade before escaping to complete an MA in creative writing. Harriet was saying, and I seem to remember this from before, that she was at Granite Noir before in 2019.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was her first event. And I remember diving into Blood Orange at that point thinking, wow, well, 4 novels later, Harriet's back again, which I am so excited. And I'm delighted that I get the chance to chat to you again. So that's fantastic. But also, very exciting, we can introduce Nilesha Shobit, who's an author and campaigner, whose book, 2 days I read it in, exposes the horrific world of online predators. 2 days I read it. It's stunning. And actually, I was saying to Nilesha, I'm kind of still processing it because there's a lot. I think it's something that I could go back to and pick more out of it. Nalesha's also managing director of Goods, which is a purpose-driven creative agency servicing commercial brands, not-for-profit and charities. And there's some really interesting stuff in that as well. So we have got so much to talk about tonight. But we will leave a bit of time for questions. Harriet, first of all, a theme I've picked up over the years with some writers is the going from law into writing. Tell me about that journey. And when you were practicing law, were you writing then?
No.
So you had to stop one to do the other?
Well, there was a hiatus between stopping law and then starting writing. And the reason that I stopped law was because I had a baby, and I was a criminal barrister, which is a very long hour, inflexible, demanding job where you need to be able to travel at the drop of a hat. And I was the primary carer for our son, and it simply wasn't possible to do the job and to look after him as well. So I stopped, and I was a stay-at-home mum for a few years, which I have to say I did not take a great deal of pleasure from. Aspects of it,
like your honesty.
You know, no. I mean, he's lovely, and I'm very happy to have done that. But at the same time, I felt very overqualified to be the expert on where the pants were in the house. I'd done an English degree before I had done a law conversion, and I had always read, I'd sort of read all my life. And so it did eventually come to me that actually I could start trying to write. And I started trying, and I found it almost impossible, and I gave up because I couldn't work out what to do with inverted commas, which might sound stupid, but there it is. And then I found out that a friend had got a place on an MA of creative writing, and my initial reaction was one of complete fury, which I couldn't explain at all. I was like, that absolute bastard.
So you were envious.
And then I realised that it was pure total jealousy, because it was what I wanted to do. And I looked at what you needed for that, and 5,000 words. And it gave me a framework. I'm really grateful to him now, and obviously very pleased that he did it. But it gave me a framework, and I started doing an evening course, and that was such a brilliant escape, and I found that I liked it, and I could make it, a sentence led to a paragraph, led to a story, and I really, really enjoyed it. And then I just kept on going and did the MA, and that was the first time that I had properly engaged both the legal experience I'd had and my love of crime fiction to
so
write.
You were always a crime fiction fan?
I had always
then.
been a crime fiction fan, absolutely, sort of from reading it, and particularly sort of female-led detective fiction, like Patricia Cornwell and Sue Grafton and P.D. James, who I'm talking about tomorrow with her Unsuitable Job for a Woman. And I started off doing dystopian feminist stuff, which was absolutely shockingly bad. And it was only when I embraced the fact that psychological thriller was the thing that I loved, why shouldn't I have a go at writing it, but that with the criminological legal aspect that I've brought in with, as you picked up in all of the books, that it's sort of woven through.
Yes, absolutely.
And it seems to have given me a niche that I really enjoy inhabiting and that I really enjoy working with. So, and it is hugely pleasing that work I did in my 20s as a student on literature, plus all of the experience of being a criminal barrister, is something that I've been able to repurpose with a second career that, I was first published at 46, and that I get to do it now. When I had thought, those years when I was standing at the school gate, that it was all over, it is very pleasing.
That's really interesting. I don't know if anyone was here last night. Carol Haley was talking about the absolute joy and privilege of having a second career. Because she hits about the same. Maybe she was late 40s when she just stopped law and just went into writing. And the joy for her was like, do you know what? I've got another adventure. Nalesha, tell me about your journey. And how writing has emerged from what you were doing before and how that journey looked.
So I definitely didn't intend to be a crime writer at all. I had no aspiration to be a crime writer. I had an aspiration to write, and I thought that I would write sort of self-help to be honest, because I spent a long time studying theology. I was then ordained as a minister, so I was quite active in the interfaith movement. I was in I was very much a hippie in my 20s, so I was in and out of meditation circles and all of that kind of stuff. And I thought, I'll probably write something that is self-help. It was a really big thing at the time. And then I discovered, you could actually talk about self-help in a way that was in the novel form. So Paulo Coelho wrote The Alchemist, and I thought, I'll probably write something like that. But then what happened was my career, my day job, which I'm still working, so I actually have 2 careers at the same time. Yeah. My day job was really active, and I work in advertising. I've always worked in advertising, and I still work in advertising. I've had 30 years in advertising, and it's a really intensive world of travelling and all of that stuff, and being at the beck and call of clients and long nights, working on campaigns and stuff. So I kind of thought, I'll write on the outskirts, and it never quite happened. I would write bits and pieces, and then I started to write short stories. And then what happened was, in 2016, I thought, right, that's it. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write. I'm going to knock out some novels. and I did write one, a really terrible novel, when I was 26, in sort of handwritten pencil. It was so bad. No one will ever see that. And that was actually my first attempt at trying to do something sort of,
And was that self-helpy? No.
That was self-helpy meets novel. It was terrible. So it didn't work at all. And then in 2016, when I started to write short stories and when I started to come to the novel, which is, long form, I realised that everybody kept dying. There were murders and it was getting darker. I actually set out to write love stories. so I wrote this I thought, I'm going to write this sweeping love story between 2 people. It's going to be a taboo thing. And I went on the Faber Academy course, and I wrote this novel, and then people kept dying. Someone drowned in a swimming pool, and somebody else was... And then I realised that actually there's a sort of dark element that suits me.
You're drawn to that, yeah.
I'm drawn to it, but it also suits the kind of ideas that I'm exploring. And then that novel was terrible. In fact, there's a whole story about that novel, which I'm not going to get into, but it was so bad. And then I sat down and I thought, you know what, I just give up. I'm just going to write the most outrageous novel that I can think of for myself. Wow. I actually don't care about being published. I don't care about finding an agent. It was lockdown, and it was a very stressful time. And to entertain myself, I wrote The Revenge of Rita Marsh.
Wow.
And that was the novel that attracted an agent. She sent me an email and said, I want this novel. I had won an award with it.
How long did it take you to write?
So I had started it, and then I had sent a few 100 words to the London Writers' Awards, and I had won an award. So the prize was a year-long development, and it was free. Wow. So I was like, wow, this is brilliant. It's lockdown. I don't have to travel, so I'll just do the development. And through that course, through that development, I got spotted by an agent. My agent is now Andrew. And she wrote to me and she said, I've just seen your synopsis and I want this novel.
That's amazing.
And I said, it's not ready.
What did that feel like?
It was incredible. It was incredible because...
You thought, oh God, I've got to do it now.
I said to her, it's not ready. She said, I don't care, just send me anything. Just send me short stories, anything you've written. And I went into a panic because everything that I had written was terrible. And also my style with Rita had completely changed. So the book took me to a place that was so extreme that I didn't... And I think it was because we were in lockdown. If you read the book, there's a sort of doomsday feel to it, and there were lots of stories emerging about Jeffrey Epstein and all of that, Jimmy Savile. Yeah. There was a lot of talk about...
Type of time as well, wasn't it?
Predators and paedophilia and the sexual exploitation of children, which was very rampant, actually, in lockdown because kids were forced online. Yeah. So that's how it happened for me.
I love that story. I'm going to ask, I'd like to know a wee bit about your books, or the audience about your books, Harriet. Tell me a wee bit about your latest one. Tell me about it.
It's about 3 women, each of them seemingly in very separate circumstances, who are eventually brought together in a slightly madcap way that we have. It opens with a woman who has just about to spend her last night in prison after a 3-year prison sentence. And the next day, she has been unexpectedly been put in the cell with someone that she doesn't know who's serving her first night. And the next day, Anna wakes to discover a body in her cell. And after she's released, really the question that drives her is, who is this dead woman and why has she come to take her life in the way that she has? We then meet a postgraduate student at Oxford called Lucy, who has a thumping great crush on her very sexy professor, who really is a man who
You're
should
very
know
attracted
better.
to that
I
professor,
find
aren't you?
Edgar
Very
immensely...
attracted. So are you.
I'm very attracted to Edgar.
Edgar's quite fit, but he has to be for the story to work. And so that very inappropriate relationship is playing out. And then we have a third woman who is living in a particularly weird and slightly dystopian circumstance up in the Great Wilderness in the far northwest of Scotland, in an environment where it's quite off-grid in a really quite surreal way. And I had set out really I'd got a bit fed up with the feedback I get saying I'd guessed it at page 67 for earlier books, because, readers are very clever and always do guess what you're trying to do, and you are playing cat and mouse with the reader. So I thought with this book, no, you're not going to be at page 67, there is no way you're going to know. I still get people saying, oh, when it all came together, I worked it out.
No.
And I'm like, oh, shut up.
No,
come on. I don't believe
nonsense.
you. Don't believe you. But it's a departure because it's the first time that I have used 3 different points of view. And to have, because you really spend quite a long time with each of the characters separately. And I am inviting trust from the reader in the sense that, if you go with me, you might not know where it's going, but, I do promise that I'm going to bring it together in a way that, you may find pleasing, that people, I think, do quite like the conclusion. And it was it was a weird book to write because it came after I'd spent 6 months planning something else, and my editor went slightly mad and said, you can't set it in a distillery in the Highlands because women don't drink whiskey. Which is, I know, exactly.
That was a reaction.
No, that was, he was wrong, is all I can say.
Wow.
And one of the reasons that I do not drink at all anymore is precisely because women do drink whiskey. But he said, why can't you make this? And he moved it down to Oxfordshire, and then he said, why don't you make it a vineyard in the south of France? And I was like, that's just not going to happen, Jack. So we had to scrap all this careful work and start again. And we played, I don't know if you know the reference Monkey Tennis from Alan Partridge, but you just sit there throwing terrible ideas at each other until something sticks. But his terrible idea was Shawshank Redemption, but women. And something about that, I went away, I watched Shawshank Redemption, and I had been thinking about law, because my distillery book had no law in it. And it gelled, but it was a book that, obviously it's fiction, so this is true for all of them, but I really did make it up as I went along. There was no kind of plan, there was no kind of end goal, except I knew that there had to be a conclusion. And these characters, I was sort of walking along, and then suddenly, there's this foxy professor, let's have him in. And it just, it took about 6 months to write, and then it took 9 months to edit because it was hell. And I don't think I ever want to do something on the fly.
What do you mean hell? Do you
the
mean
editing, just putting it
down?
apart and making it come together in a way that made sense. Because it made sense in my head, sort of, but it's complex.
Yes.
I think it does work now.
Absolutely.
I haven't had people saying that they're confused, which is what... But there were points when it was very confusing in earlier drafts, and even I was confused. So,
so that's fine-tuned and fine-tuning.
Yeah, fine-tuning and fine-tuning. But I'm very proud of it now as an achievement, a feat of engineering. I think it came together in the end.
Oh, for sure. And we can talk a wee bit more about the process soon. But Nalisha, tell me about your book.
So,
Give us
The
a
Revenge of Rita Marsh is the title in hardback, and in paperback it's Her Two Lives. And it's all about Rita Marsh, who leads a double life. So by day, she takes care of the elderly and the infirm, and then by night, she preys on predators online, and she poses as a child with the intention to honey trap men who are looking for underage children. And gathering all the evidence, she then organises a sting and meets up with these men in real life and confronts them. She then hands over all of the evidence to the police, and the whole confrontation is filmed. So the book, when we open the book, we open on a sting, and what happens is the sting goes terribly wrong, and Rita realises that this double life is really, not only is it high maintenance, but it's now becoming a liability, and it's very dangerous. And she's part of a group, in fact, she's the founder of the group called Raven Justice, and she has a big fallout with two of the men in the group. And she decides to walk away from it all and to focus on herself and to reinvent herself and to find out who she really is, because she's also ambling through life quite lost. And what happens is she goes to a high school reunion, and at this time a story emerges about a school teacher that she knew at school, where he is accused of grooming underage girls. At the high school reunion, she reunites with a former friend of hers called Layla, and it emerges that Layla was one of the girls that was having an affair with Stellans. And what happens is that she is thrown much deeper into her paedophile hunting than she would like, because she has very strong feelings towards Layla, so she has no choice but to avenge for the wrong that Layla has endured, because Layla, as a victim, is struggling to accept that she has been abused.
So, tell me where all this came from, and the timing of it, you've mentioned already, was interesting, because there was the Me Too movement, there was a lot happening in the news, and I suppose maybe we can tie it into reclaiming the narrative as well, because we spoke about that just in the green room. Yeah, so tell us a bit more.
So it's really interesting, because the theme of this talk is about reclaiming the narrative. And I was reflecting on this a few days ago, because the story of how the novel came about is quite interesting. So I had this idea in my head to write a story set in high school, because I just think that that's always interesting. I just love high school stories, you know, all the sort of salacious things that happens in adolescence. And I had this story about an underage girl having an affair with a teacher, and that being my version of a taboo love story. And it just wouldn't come together. And it also felt inherently wrong, because society has changed. Gone are the days of Lolita, where novels like that are kind of socially unacceptable. And at the same time, that story had already been told with My Dark Vanessa. So My Dark Vanessa came out, and that story was very much about somebody who, as a grown woman, realises that the affair that she has with her teacher was fundamentally wrong. And it really is a good story, and it explores that sort of shift in societal norms, where previously, men might be high-fiving, having an affair with a girl, but actually it really is abuse, and she's trying to make sense of it. So when I revisited Rita, I kind of thought, this is not Layla's story that I want to write. And I happened to be watching an interview on TV one day. It was Piers Morgan. Love him or loathe him, I don't know how you feel about him. I sort of tolerate him on TV, but he was engaged in because he does these really good debates, doesn't he? And he was engaged in a really good debate with a Metropolitan Police officer and a paedophile hunter. Interesting. And it was fascinating. You can still watch the interview on YouTube, by the way. It was fascinating, because when I was watching the interview, I kind of understood what the copper was saying, which is paedophile hunters interfere in the justice system, because what they're doing is breaking the law, but also the way that they gather the evidence is really questionable. But at the same time, I felt really sympathetic towards the paedophile hunter, because I kind of understood where he was coming from. And in that moment, the whole thing came together, because I realised this isn't Layla's story at all. Layla had a friend, and her friend was called Rita Marsh, who grew up to be a paedophile hunter. So the narrative is reclaimed through the words of Rita, who is actually a vigilante.
That's fascinating. I want to go a bit back to the process that you touched on Harriet, so you're bringing 3 strands together. I'm really interested about your writing process. So we were talking to Carol last night, who had like a psycho room, she called it, but she had she immersed herself in her character of a psychopath. What do? Do you just start and you just write and off you go?
Well, that one was, yeah. I mean,
Wow.
it was a shambles. It was a shambles, and I think it was because I had spent so long doing this very intense planning of the book before, and that had gone so wrong, because it had showed me if you have a plan and if you show it to people, then they start to interfere and they start saying, "Oh, that's not going to work."
So you just wanted to...
And I just wanted something that was just, I let him see a paragraph of, there's a woman, she wakes up, someone's dead. And then I went away and I did it. And it was allowed to emerge in a way that was completely without any mediation or interference. And then it needed a lot of interference to make it actually work. But I think I learned a lot from doing it that way, which was basically never to do it that way again. It was by the seat of my pants, and that there was it had a power of narrative to it that it sort of pushed through, but it meant that it was such a mess to sort out. It was awful. And I have the book I've just finished, which is going to be out next year.
Yeah.
I approached that very differently. I didn't overplan. I certainly didn't discuss it too much, but I did spend about 6-9 months researching and just thinking about the way that I wanted it to fit together, so that when it came to writing it, I had a much clearer vision. I don't have a psycho room. I have lots of notes, which actually I tend to keep on my computer.
Did you have a sorry to interrupt, did you know the ending? So when you were starting writing the one...
Actually, no, this, with Cruelty, I knew that it needed to have justice as an ending. But what form that justice would take was something that I didn't know. And I think that was a timely reminder that you gave about the fact that the theme of this is reclaiming the narrative, because I need to stick to the brief. But bearing in mind that mine is a book about, it opens in prison and it deals with women within the criminal justice system and how they're served, which is, in short, very badly, that I did want to make sure that whatever happened, I shone a light onto the futility of incarceration. I mean, I don't think prison works full stop. I mean, there are some people who do need to be locked up. There is no getting away from that. But the way that we're currently doing prison and the way that we're currently dealing with punishment is not leading to a safer, more stable society. It's leading to reoffending, recidivism, and the problem just increases on itself. And
it's a big debate in Scotland just now because of the overcrowding. And
well,
are you saying that also
exactly
from a former criminal barrister?
Yeah, from a former criminal, because I did mostly defence work. So, I met a lot of people who had offended or who were, going back inside because they couldn't cope with life on the outside, because they'd been given none of the rehabilitation that they needed and none of the tools they needed for life on the inside, life on the outside rather. And so the ending that I had in mind was as a way of trying to, to try to show the story of, this poor dead woman and who she was and how she had ended up in that situation. It was very important to me that was something that was uncovered, albeit within the mechanism of a thriller. So, with improbable coincidences and madcap car chases and all of the like, that there is a core there was a core truth that I really wanted to ensure came through. And that really was the kind of guiding light, I suppose, of where the story took me, even if it wasn't something that gave me complete plot clarity at the beginning. I knew that it had to take me there by the end. I mean, I know it's a slightly woolly way of explaining it, but I think if you know what you don't want it to be message driven, because if you're hitting people over the head with your statements or with your your campaigning, it can be very off-putting. But if it's a good story and it happens to have a good social message, I think that is something that can be quite compelling. And as we've seen with the Post Office. I had a complete blank there.
Yeah,
Post Office
Horizon.
and Mr. Bates. You know, that
Yeah.
the power of dramatising
Absolutely.
injustice is something that's very, very powerful. So I think that if you have that in your mind, as I did, then it will mean that the story will work itself out, because, you know, you're doing what society doesn't tend to, which is to give people a second chance, and, you know, perhaps to give them an ending that you would like to see, even if in real life it wouldn't be like that at all.
I think that's chiming with you, isn't it? I suppose the theme of spotlighting something. How important is that to you, that is part of your writing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think as a writer, you change the more that you write. And so I've written my next novel already, and it's going to be out next year. And having gone through that process and already knowing what's sort of in my pipeline, if you like, I can see that I think there'll always be a bigger dimension to my work. So it'll always have some sort of point of view on the world that we live in. But I'm also very conscious of not, like you say, bashing people over the head, because the last thing you want to be is an evangelist. They are actually the most boring person in the room. And we are all different, and we are entitled to different points of view. And I think that it's really important that the job of the novelist is to tell the story and actually to refrain from having a personal point of view. Because I think all the characters deserve airtime. It just so happens that in The Revenge of Rita Marsh, you know, I decided to spotlight Rita, and she is very much a vigilante and a sort of social activist. Her morality is slightly warped, but nonetheless, she's still entitled. I even give Stellans some airtime. Less, because he deserves less airtime.
But you also explain her morality and where it's come from and how it changes slightly. And she's sometimes on that precipice, isn't she? Either way.
She is.
But I understand why, though.
She is, and also, you know, Rita, through Rita's character, we explore the cycle of abuse. So she's predatory herself because she has her own trauma that she's processing. So there is a little bit of a sort of cyclical nature of that. But I think it's really important to just tell the story first. And if there's a bigger dimension, great. If there isn't, it's okay just to have a, you know, for it to just be really entertaining. I tend to not enjoy those novels as much, though, if I'm being honest. I tend not to enjoy crime novels that are just, you know, a really good, I mean, they might be a brilliant thriller, but I particularly enjoy and really admire those novels that do so much more than just tell the story.
What would you read when you're not writing? I know you're both voracious readers. What would you be reading? Do you read a lot of crime fiction?
It's really interesting because I am not someone that actually read a lot of crime, but my favourite book of all time is actually a sort of thriller. It's The Collector by John Fowles, which I think is one of the greatest novels.
I think that's
and I read it when I was 14, so it's very old now. But
do you go back and read it again?
Yeah, I've read it so many times. Yeah, and and it's funny because my agent also, when we had our first meeting together, we were talking about, you know, what novels we love, and she had also read The Collector at 14.
So that was
so that was our sort of connection. But yeah, reading that at 14, and I just remembered trembling
really
at the sudden awareness that a crime novel can do that. Wow. You know, and that literature can do that, because it is quite a literary novel, and it's interesting because that novel does actually talk about class in as much as it talks about the crime. You know, I won't give it away in case you want to read it. It's fantastic. But I also, you know, I love authors like Abigail Dean. I think she's doing great work. But then I also enjoy work that's got nothing to do with crime. So one of my favourite authors is actually Hanif Qureshi, who is another favourite author, and I've admired him so much because of what he did at a time when it was really difficult to tell certain stories as a sort of British Asian writer. You know, I just think he's fabulous. And I also love writers like Deborah Levy. So I actually really enjoy sort of very literary writers.
Yeah. Harriet, are you still reading a lot of crime when you've got time?
I get sent a lot. You know, I get sent a lot of proofs, and I do try, and I don't always manage. And in the last 18 months, because I've been concentrating so much reading on the book that I've been writing, I have completely fallen off with contemporary, unfortunately. But
what would you go back to? What's your comfort book?
if I said Lord of the Rings, you'd have to not judge me on that. But
There is no judgment in this room.
I'm
It's a
afraid
safe
that
space.
I reread Lord of the Rings. I also actually found myself rereading some Georgette Hare recently because I was in so much need of consolation when I was doing
comfort.
She's funny. Again, across the board, I mean, I'm not genre specific. I think I tend to read more crime simply because I'm sent crime and also because it has been my first love. And I think that, again, because I've been preparing for this P.D. James event that I'm chairing tomorrow, that I read something, she said something really interesting about how it's within crime novels that you actually get the most social realism. And it ties in with something Ian Rankin said when he came and lectured us when I was at UEA, and that he liked the idea of having a police officer as the protagonist because, of course, in a police investigation, again, it brings in aspects of class here, and the police officer can go everywhere from the prince to the pauper and get this complete slice of life. And that, you know, when you think about it does seem, and I mean, I'm going to make a huge sweeping generalization here about literary fiction at the moment, but there's an awful lot of 30-something women having a bit of a nervous breakdown about whatever it is they're doing, which is, you know, all fine and good, but not necessarily very, you know, it might reaffirm your own issues, but it doesn't necessarily take you outside of yourself and open your mind at all.
But these they don't last, do they? Do you think that'll be a passing?
I don't know. I mean, I'm probably not the right demographic for them either. Whereas, you know, a good chunky crime novel will take you to places that, you know, it will take you all around the world because there is this huge global sweep of, I mean, I've just had this amazing trip to India, which was centered around the novels of the author Abir Mukherjee, who does, I don't know if you've read him, but he does these brilliant historical crime based in Calcutta in sort of 20s to 30s India. And he's also done a contemporary novel, Hunted, which sort of goes from London across America. You know, that there's the Nordic stuff, there's the Scandi, you know, there's so many different. It can take you everywhere, and it can show you so many aspects of society that you wouldn't look at normally. If I had to choose just one genre to read for the rest of my life, which fortunately I don't have to, because I think that would be a shame, but it would have to be crime, because I think that within the crime cathedral, it's you get so much, and so much of it is actually really, you know, a good novel is a good novel, and, you know, Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky is an absolutely extraordinary piece of literature. You know, you can't say, oh, well, you know, it's got a crime in it, therefore it's not worth reading. So yeah, I mean, crime would be my first love, but I do like literary, and I love rom-coms, and, you know, I like Emily Henry, and I've never read anything about sexy dragons, and I'm keeping it that way. I'm afraid the romanticy thing, no offence, but none of that for me.
It fascinates me, and, you know, you're both so passionate, obviously, about the genre and the work you do, but why we are so attracted to crime novels, and I find this fascinating, and I'm not quite sure, but I don't know if you maybe touched on it, Harriet, but is it maybe because there is often a resolution at the end when post-COVID? I mean, we talked about this before. The world is pretty mad, isn't it? It's chaos. It's chaos. We don't have much control.
Life is chaos. Life is chaos. And, you know, we're born alone, we die alone. And that, you know, we create order in retrospect by, you know, looking at hindsight and coming up with a narrative of our own lives. But, you know, in real life, there isn't the sort of the tidy ending. You know, the bad people don't go to prison, yet they end up president, whatever. It's a kind of, you know, rape convictions running at 1 or 2%, you know, shopliftings through the roof, that nothing necessarily, you know, nothing's working. It doesn't feel like things are working.
Broken.
And if you read, though, a nice rebus novel, you know, they get nicked or they're dead at the end, and it's just very, very comforting that you just kind of know, and he's there with his emphysema tank, just, you know, and it's I think that imposition of order can be very reassuring. You know, that women, we live with a certain level of fear, you know, that walking along the street at night, keys between our fingers, that, you know, by reading novels about the worst things that can happen, we're both confronting our fears and also reassuring ourselves that here we are in safety. You know, watching a situation where the serial killer is caught and it's all tidied up. I think it can be helpful and reassuring. Though I think it can go, I mean, I find the true crime fixation something, I think that the idea of serial killing as entertainment does concern me, and I don't really like that.
That's interesting.
I mean, that there's a podcast called My Favourite Murder, and I find that distasteful, I have to be honest, because, you know, murder isn't something that you should have a favourite.
That's interesting, the true... What do you make of that?
In terms of the true crime?
True crime, but also, I think Harriet was saying about we find a resolution in crime fiction when lives are chaotic at the moment. So that plus the true crime issue.
Well, it's interesting because I think the genre is actually shifting. So I think we have lived through generations where crime has had a neat and tidy resolution. I question whether that's going to be the thing that people will read in, you know, 5, 10, 15 years from now, because life isn't tidy.
Yeah.
And I think, for me, I think what's attractive about the genre, and certainly why I can understand why I'm now writing in that genre, is because you can actually explore a very wide range of different issues, socially but also personally. And I think you can really explore the very darkest aspects of humanity. And I think that when we get comfortable exploring these dark things, then we can truly embrace the light, I think. We can really, truly evolve as humanity and humankind. And I think we need to be brave to have those conversations. And I think the genre allows us to do that. But what's happening to the genre is lots of bends. So we're all, you know, preoccupied with... romanticy and all of that stuff now, and it's doing interesting things to the crime genre as well. So I'm really excited about that, and I'm excited about the fluidity of the form. I think there'll always great storytelling will, you know, the factors and the fundamentals of great storytelling will always remain, but I'm not so attracted to tidy endings.
So because there was parts of your book that made me feel very uncomfortable, but I love that. So they should. I want writing sometimes to make me feel uncomfortable. Is that what you're talking about? So it's not just, you know, the bad man's behind bars and end of, but something that's it's more ambiguous, or?
Yeah, I think complexity is probably the word, because I think Rita is very complex.
Yes.
She has 2 lives, but she's also, I mean, in many ways, The Revenge of Rita Marsh is actually a book about integration, because she is mixed race. She is exploring her sexuality. She's got these 2 lives. And there are many polarities in the book, and it was my way of exploring what it means to be a second-generation Asian now, actually. You would never think it, but that's actually one of the things that I was exploring, because having grown up as a second generation with the first generation having made huge sacrifices for us and all of that stuff, you know, everybody knows that sort of Asian success story of, you know, our forefathers coming here with £5 in their back pocket and then setting up £1 million businesses, you know, and sacrificing for their children, and then look how successful we are now, you know. But I was actually really fascinated to explore what happens when the second generation kids fuck it up, you know, and
it's not talked about.
Yeah, it's not talked about.
And
actually, I wanted to write the anti-immigration story. You know, what happens when they do something completely different, and our parents are aghast. I mean,
what response have you had to
what, from the Asian community? It's interesting because there hasn't been huge commentary. The sort of one review I read sort of said something like, "It's not for everyone, but it's brave."
Really?
And I was delighted. I was so delighted.
Yeah. Would it be better if they were just upfront and honest with you? Because it's a bit taboo. So what you've written about then, in a way, is a bit taboo.
Oh, it's incredibly taboo, and it's very taboo for the Asian community anyway.
Yes.
But I think it is. I think it is taboo for us as society anyway.
It's interesting.
You know, and it's really interesting. You know, love him or loathe him, there's lots of men like this, isn't there? Like Elon Musk, when he's having a go at, Keir Starmer about the fact that we have this issue of abuse in society and the grooming gang, and nobody's talking about it. He's not necessarily wrong. It is a very difficult thing to talk about, and yet it is one of the biggest issues that we have in society when we've already got so many other things going wrong.
Yeah.
It really is a stain on society that we have the scale of a problem like this.
Yeah, people are scared to talk about it, they aren't,
It's-
in a way, and
they're
particularly
scared.
online. You can't discuss it online.
Yeah, and we do live in a sort of woke society. We do live in a world where there's hypersensitivity of getting it wrong. But we live in a world where we do need to sort these issues out as well.
Do you ever feel when you're writing, you go, oh, I can't say that because, oh God, I'm going to get cancelled? Or because, you speak to comedians who are always thinking that, and some authors who go, how's this going to go down with changing attitudes and people perhaps, as you were saying, being a bit more sensitive? Does that ever occur to you?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that because I tend to write more from my own experience, I sort of keep it relatively narrow anyway. I mean, I would not want to set out to cause offence.
Yeah.
And I think I take the view that there are things I wouldn't write about simply because I just don't know enough about them.
Yeah.
I suppose what I mean when I say that I write about stuff that is within my experience is that I prefer to be properly on top of the subject matter and actually to understand it as fully as I possibly can. And so it tends to mean by staying within my own ballpark that I am less likely. I don't think I would sort of seek out something that were a taboo subject. Having said that, if something came along as the book that I wanted to write, then I think I would write it if it felt true and if it felt right. I would not ever want to be, as I say, deliberately offensive and to try and sort of, Ricky Gervais, you can't say anything these days, or that sort of thing. That that isn't my ballpark, and I feel that there is enough that I can say that criticises the criminal justice system. I mean, I'm conscious of it, not so much with writing books as online, that I think having seen the way that the rhetoric has changed and that the environment is for people online, I mean, I have been fortunate never to have attracted negative comment, because I don't have a big enough following, essentially. But I think that I've seen it as a place where I used to be a lot more expansive, and I have sort of narrowed down the kind of opinions that I would express, because I just don't think for me, it's worth it. I think it is a toxic environment out there, and debate is so polarised that, whatever you say will be argued with, and I can't necessarily, nobody ever won an argument by commenting on something on Twitter. No. And so I think that on a social media basis, I've definitely limited my activities down and down and down. But I think it's good to reclaim that time anyway. I mean, I don't know, that it's not cowardice, it simply hasn't come up yet. But if it does, if the subject's there, then I would tackle it. And I mean, my work is all relatively critical of male behaviour. Yeah. I remember being asked by someone for Blood Orange, it was a book club, and it was a male reader who was really aggrieved. And I just sat there and I was like, well, that's just the book that it is, and that is the way.
Why was he aggrieved?
Because, hashtag not all men. But, there it is. And it's true, not all men, but many of them. And that's the... I mean, sometimes my husband says slightly pathetically, could there be a nice man? And I say, well, there is. He might die, though. So, from that point of view, I sort of offend 50% of the population. But then I tend to think they won't read the books anyway, because it's by a female author. So, who cares? You just get in that way.
Do you ever think, who's going to be reading my books?
I mean, in many ways, it would have made my life a lot easier if I just wrote cosy crime, and I honestly did not set out to find a taboo subject and to write
Yeah,
about it. I
yeah.
really did. And to be honest with you, it's a bit of a headache because it's a bit of a burden to carry because you do have to make sure that you're extremely sensitive to the lived experience of
So
victims.
you feel responsibility.
And I feel responsibility. And I also felt
But that's
responsibility.
good.
Yeah, but I also felt responsibility to make sure that I'm portraying the paedophile hunters who believe passionately in
Yeah.
what they do accurately as well, because they deserve their story to be told as well, even though they're breaking the law technically. But you know,
you get that empathy there as well because
yeah,
you
it's-
understand the motivations and
absolutely, because
yeah.
the intention is pure, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
It starts with pure intention. But I think, I don't know. I mean, I suspect I'm the kind of writer that will probably look for extremes because I know what I'm like and I'm an extreme personality. So I'll probably go for those kinds of things that agitate and provocate. But I also have some rules, which is for myself, mainly to protect myself, which is there's certain things I wouldn't do, you know. And I think working in the corporate world for so long and working in marketing communication, what you do learn is to know how to communicate where and when and how, and getting that tone really right. So there are things I wouldn't say in social media, and also I don't want to. You know, I've got everything that I've got to say is in my work. I have nothing more to say over and above that, to be honest.
What's next for you? You say you've completed one, or you're working on one just now.
I've just finished. It's going through the editing.
So what happens then? What's the time scale for when we will see that?
You'll see that early next year.
Early next year.
And it's
Can you give us a
another
taster?
very complicated woman in an extreme situation who snaps. That's all I can say.
Link to this?
No, it's a whole new world. It has been the worst headache of my life. Yeah, this novel has been an absolute headache. It's the toughest thing I've ever written.
I love your honesty, you two. Do you know, I'm just putting this out there. I'm just thinking, because you talked about this book being just absolutely atrocious. I'm not convinced that Guy would sit, and one of the male authors that I've chaired before would sit there and say, would be so self-deprecating.
Maybe not in public, but I'm sure, I think these feelings are normal, aren't they? I mean, all writers have insecurities, and I think it'd be amiss if we weren't honest about that. That's the creative process.
And you have finished one as well?
Yeah, I've finished one, and that is also going to be out in spring of next year. And it's about the juror on a murder trial of two girls who believe that they're witches. Contemporary, set in Edinburgh.
Wow.
Because High Court trials in Scotland do not have opening speeches. Yeah. So I could have the mystery, simply the unfurling of the case. But it meant spending quite a long time down a rabbit hole of reading about witchcraft.
Yeah.
And I don't want to read any more about
done with
witchcraft. I think me and the supernatural have had our time. And
is there an element of supernatural to it?
Well, you'll have to read it to find out. But he begins as a very rational heart surgeon. But how does he end? By the end of the trial, how is Matthew Phillips? And we are calling it, it's a lovely Ron Seal title, Witch Trial.
That's what it says in the tin?
It's exactly what it says on the tin. Only it is contemporary, and I have to say, it was... My editor has said the ending is a mic drop moment, and I have been so audacious in some respects. Not because it's taboo or anything else, but I've been really wicked with the way that I've played with the narrative, and I'm very, very pleased with myself indeed.
And
I'm not being self-deprecating at all about it. I think it's bloody brilliant.
I love that.
And it is one of those
books, Leslie signing bloody brilliant as well.
So it's it's a sort of, I'm kind of over cruelty now. Please do buy it though; it's a good book. But no, Witch Trial. But I think the thing I have learnt now, and that what I really do like at being at book, I remember being here and being terrified in 2019.
Oh, yeah.
I was completely. I was so like rabbits in headlights about the whole thing. To have finished fifth book, it's what I have realised is that each time I think that it's the best thing I've done, and that apart from book 2, which I hate and will always hate, but you know, each time I think it's the best. Forget all the rest. This is the best one I've done, and I think that it's lovely how there's always another book, you know, and then you go and you write another book, and you'll love that book, or you will love this book eventually, even if it's been a hell process to get there. And it is the most exciting job that you get to sit and make stuff up and go into this world for a period of time, and then you forget completely about it and move on to the next one, and that is just, it's such a privilege to be
notice I
able
didn't
to
ask
do
you any
it.
specific plot lines.
Yeah, no,
just
thank
in
you. I've
case.
got no idea. Is there
Not
a
a
baby?
clue.
There's a baby, really?
No.
No idea.
moved on to witches. I'm conscious of the time because I wondered if anyone has got any questions. Then feel free to ask. Yes, lady in the front. Have we got a mic?
And my questions are really all for Harriet. And just on the context of social media, I really only found your work recently because of your new posting on Blue Sky.
Oh, gosh.
And read
Interesting.
Blood Orange, which I
What did you make of it?
absolutely hated it, completely loved.
There we
It's
go.
horrible in the narrative and brilliant in the ending.
Marmite,
It's
Marmite,
so
but truly
beautifully
Marmite.
well written.
Oh, thank
That
you.
was good, but I
And
think
actually, that's probably the literary question, which is around. I'm finding a lot of stuff is coming through on coercive control, and I just wondered if you would care to comment on that. I wanted to ask one other superficial question. Did your friend who did the MA in creative writing ever write anything that we would have heard
good question.
And
Like that.
I bet he didn't. And please write the distillery book, she says, as a whiskey drinker.
That was a belter.
Right, well, the coercive control, I think that it is, the fact that it's actually about to be made, I think it has been made a criminal offence, but it is now being even more fully codified, is a very important, you know, I've been deeply interested in that question for a long time. I mean, I don't know, the recent acquittal of the woman who killed herself, having left a notice, you know, she left a letter saying that her ex had killed her, and the catalogue of abuse that was outlined in the court case was heartbreaking, and I found it absolutely extraordinary that he was acquitted, but I suppose we are where we are. But while we are where we are, it's something I think that writers like me are going to keep on exploring and pushing at, in the hope that the more light that we can cast on it, the more it might bring about change. And actually, as a side note on Blood Orange, my proudest achievement with that book is that it caused a divorce, because
Not
someone
yours, though.
read it. No, not mine. No, close run, but not quite. When I said that absolutely none of the characters were based on him. But no, that somebody read it and recognised a pattern of behaviour in a friend's marriage, and so gave it to her friend to read. And her friend read it, and it was as if a light bulb went off, that she could actually put a name to the behaviour that she'd endured. And, you know, she got out of it, which is, you know, I think I'm really proud of that and very moved that, you know, this is the power of fiction. Distillery book, probably not, but it gets a wee bit of a side mention at the beginning of Witch Trial as a kind of fuck you to my editor, which he noted and was entertained by. Blue Sky, yeah, well, I think we're all migrating slowly over from Twitter. Just, I mean, it's not even on my part because of a particularly political stance, but just that the content's got so bad. There's so many awful adverts, and it was time.
Do you use social media much?
I mean, I sort of have to, I mean, I always have.
Just
Because
'cause
of my
work,
job.
yeah, work.
Yeah, because of my work. So
Yeah.
I'm present, but I wouldn't say that I engage much. But I think as a writer, you kind of do have to a bit.
Yeah.
So I definitely have an online presence.
Yes, yeah.
But I think, you know, forums like this are so much more meaningful because you actually get to have a nuanced conversation. You could never say this in 190 characters on on X. I mean,
Even
you
a
just
thread.
couldn't. No, I mean, and that's the problem with social media, which is that it's very polarized. There is no nuance. It's black or white. And that's the problem with social media. So more live experience, more intimate conversations, more festivals, I think is the future.
Yeah.
Loving that. One more question, or I realise we've gone slightly over. Harriet, you're back tomorrow, aren't you? Do you want to plug your event?
Yes, so tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we are discussing P.D. James. I am chairing an academic, Dr. Elizabeth Anderson from the university, and also the author Sam Blake, who sadly her plane got blown off course. So she's going to have to join us online on the big screen because she wasn't able to get over from Ireland. But the three of us are going to be discussing P.D. James and what perhaps I suppose we could call her legacy has been. Faber are reissuing her Adam Dalgliesh novels steadily, and I think that she's a really, really interesting author, and I think that they're both going to have a lot to say on her. So please do come along and join us.
Have you enjoyed your festival experience? Because you've not been to Granite Noir before.
No, it's my first one, and it's been great. But I do love Scotland, because I went to bloody Scotland, and that was just such a lovely... And that's the thing about the crime community as well. You know, as a sort of reluctant crime author coming into... it's such a lovely...
It's the best.
And there's an irony in that, isn't there? That crime authors are actually the loveliest people.
You're all very good at promoting each other as well. I think if you start reading your books, it will lead on to another crime writer's book and to another crime writer's book. There's lots to go around.
No one ever walked into a bookshop and left just with one book.
No.
You know, and it's and if you like a book, you know, I think that it's a brilliant ecosystem. And you know, what raises one raises us all. So, but as for the romance authors, though,
that's what I heard.
No, you're not allowed to say that. They get very upset, and you don't want them upset.
They're quite backstabby.
I'm going to get the dragons on me next.
Well, on that note, Nalesha and Harriet, thank you so much. And I know this is the point where my Granite Noir colleagues go, oh God, Shauna's going to ask them back next year, isn't she? Yeah, would you come back next year, please?
Talk about my witches.
Yes. And we will look forward to your novel next year as well. Thank you so much. Massive thank you, as always, to Aberdeen Performing Arts, who put on this festival. I think it's year 10 next year, which is incredible. And if you've not been before, I hope you've enjoyed it, and go and see other events. And if you have been before, thank you for coming back again, because your support means that the festival keeps going. And thank you, as always, to Leslie. I sped up again, Leslie, sorry. Anyway, thank you so much. Thanks,